This is an OCR GCSE History revision video based around the question, what is the message of this cartoon? And of course it's worth 6 points. You can see from the source of the cartoon that it was published in 1919. And I've got the key details over here in a slightly larger font. And you can see that it was published in 1919 in the German magazine Simplicissimus. So it's coming from the German point of view. And this central character here, a mother, is saying to her starving child, the German mother is saying to her starving child, when we have paid 100 billion marks, then I can give you something to eat. So in this video we're going to look at the overall message of it, and you'll have an opportunity to try and look at the symbols contained with it yourself. Whenever answering an exam question, we always need to consider the mark scheme, the success criteria. So here we've got just 1 or 2 marks out of 6 is when you simply answer the question and you don't back that up with any key details from the source. For 3 to 4 marks out of 6, that's when you do look at the source itself and you look at some of the symbols. So for example, who does this woman represent? Who does this child with the bone sticking out represent? And another child there. Have a look at the key aspects within this cartoon, and we're always thinking, what message does this send out to the audience? It's also really important that you do actually consider the writing that accompanies this source, because that's really important. And of course, for the full marks, you always need to consider the contextual knowledge. What was going on at the time here with regards to 1919, and include some points about what was going on at the time to push for maximum marks. Let's have a look at the contextual knowledge, simply meaning what was going on at the time. And here we have a newspaper cutting. This clearly signalled that the war had ended, as the armistice was signed to signal that the fighting was over. This was signed at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918. And as with all wars, peace treaties are signed. And this tells the victors what they may gain, and it tells those countries that surrender what they must do and what regulations they have to live by. And this was signed at the Palace of Versailles in France. Now, who would decide that would go on the treaty? They became known as the so-called Big Three. We have Clemenceau of France, who wanted an aggressive treaty. He wanted to make sure that France could never be attacked by Germany again. He wanted to cripple their army and to punish them so severely that they would never pose a threat again. David Lloyd George was under pressure from the British public to punish Germany, but he also wanted to make sure that Germany could trade with Britain, so that would help the British economy and jobs and to make money. President Wilson wanted much more of a lenient treaty. He actually wanted to help to rebuild the country and to make sure that Germany would prosper again, and that this would help world peace. But ultimately it seemed that even though the countries had to compromise, George Clemenceau did indeed get quite a harsh treaty. The German army had to reduce its soldiers to no more than 100,000 men. The German Empire lost its overseas colonies. The country itself lost about 10% of its land. And ultimately the German people felt that they had been wronged by all of this. They felt that ultimately that the peace treaty was far too severe, and that as a result of that they felt that they had been harshly treated. Now, a key aspect of the treaty itself is the fact that they had to pay reparations, also known as like compensation. And it's clear that the sum would cripple the country itself. They were told that they had to pay 100 billion marks. This was a massive sum at the time. This was the equivalent at the time of £6.6 billion, and many historians estimate that this could be the equivalent of today's £750 billion. Now, this was a massive sum, and this is key to understanding the meaning of the cartoon itself. So in a moment it will be your turn to press pause, and you'll begin to decipher some of the messages that are contained within this cartoon to think about what the overall one is. Everything within this cartoon has been designed for a reason by the author, to send certain messages out to the audience. You need to think about what those messages are. Don't forget to take into consideration the context of 1919, of what was going on at the time. Don't forget, it's also essential to bear in mind the writing here. What's the overall message of this? you'll need to use key details from the source and contextual knowledge. So press pause now. So let's have a look at the overall message of the cartoon itself. We can see here that where this German family is living, it looks as though they are already living in poverty. We can see that because it looks scruffy and untidy, it looks really small. It's really important that we pay close attention to the writing that accompanies the source. The German mother, clearly shown here, is actually saying, when we have paid 100 billion marks, then I can give you something to eat. Now this is a clear reference to the reparations that they had to pay under the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore it is a criticism of the big three, of those the leaders of the countries, of the Allied countries. And we can see here that the child that she's talking about is obviously suffering. You can see there from the ribs that are showing that it's clearly a malnourished child, and it's really struggling to be able to cope with the fact that Germany is so poor. The mother itself could represent German mothers, or it could represent the government at the time, and it's struggling to feed its people. And consequently, children across the country are starving and they are living in really poor living conditions. I think it's also really important to note that, of course, you make reference to 1919 and that this is when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. This is a criticism of what happened. And don't forget, it's coming from the German magazine Simplicissimus. So this could show us that this was what some of the Germans were feeling at the time. It shows what their attitudes were. So when you're answering the question, it's really important that you directly answer it within the opening sentences. You clearly state what the message is. Then you will need to go on even further and you'll need to use source details to back up your points. So you'll begin to mention here some of the key aspects contained within the cartoon. Really important that you include these, and now it just might be 2 or even 3, but you make reference to the details of the sources to back up your points. Then it's really key that you include the contextual knowledge of what was going on at the time. You will make it clear that in 1919 the Treaty of Versailles itself had been signed, and that it was the German people who were criticising the big three and the Allies. They felt that they were being treated too harshly. They felt that they would not be able to cope under the massive strain of 4 years of total war and the massive reparations that were dictated to them under the Treaty of Versailles.